My name is Savannah, and at 34 years old, I thought I was finally getting the family reconciliation I had always wanted. When I was on a supposedly healing family vacation in the Bahamas, I received a chilling, encrypted message from an unknown international number. The text ordered me to fly home immediately and warned me not to say a word to my mother or brother. When I went to pack my bags, I found my hotel safe completely emptied. But the real horror began when I overheard my mother in the next room calmly discussing my impending disappearance. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to use you for their own gain. The midday sun was beating down on the pristine white deck of our ultra-exclusive resort suite in the Bahamas. I was sitting at a glass patio table nursing a sparkling water, trying to ignore the mounting tension in my chest. My mother Beatrice was lounging on a chaise sipping a mimosa with the practiced elegance of someone who believed she owned the world. My older brother Cameron was sprawling on a sofa nearby, scrolling through his phone and nursing a massive hangover. We were supposed to be here to reconnect, to build bridges after decades of silence. Instead, I felt like a walking wallet. The breaking point arrived when a resort concierge stepped onto our private terrace carrying a silver tray. He walked past my mother and brother, stopping directly next to my chair. With a polite bow, he placed a leather folder on the glass table. I opened it, assuming it was the bill for our room service breakfast. My breath caught in my throat. It was a charge for $30,000. The itemized receipt listed a private luxury yacht charter, premium champagne catering for 20 people, and a massive damage fee for a broken glass table on the lower deck. I stared at the numbers, completely bewildered. I had spent the entire previous day reading a book on the beach alone. I looked over at Cameron. He did not even have the decency to look guilty. He just offered a lazy, entitled smirk. I turned to my mother. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight with suppressed anger. Beatrice did not even bother to sit up. She took a delicate sip of her drink and waved her manicured hand dismissively. "Hand over your black card, Savannah," she said coldly. "You owe us this vacation. After all the trouble you caused growing up, paying for your brother's little yacht excursion is the least you can do. We let you back into our lives, did we not?" I felt the blood rushing to my face. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the humid ocean air. I closed the leather folder and pushed it back toward the center of the table. "I am not paying $30,000 for a yacht party I was not even invited to," I said firmly. Cameron scoffed loudly, tossing his phone onto the cushions. "Come on, Savannah. You literally audit massive corporations for a living. Your financial forensics firm pulled in millions last year. 30 grand is pocket change for you. Stop being so cheap and just pay the bill." I stood up from my chair. "It is not about the money, Cameron. It is about the fact that you used my name to charter a boat, trashed it, and now expect me to foot the bill while Mother treats it like some sort of penalty tax for my existence." Beatrice finally sat up, her designer sunglasses sliding down her nose as her face hardened into a mask of pure cruelty. "You listen to me," she hissed. "You have always been a difficult, ungrateful child. I should have left you at your impoverished Aunt Marie's house to rot when you were 9. The mention of Aunt Marie felt like a physical blow. When I was just a 9-year-old girl, Beatrice had packed my clothes into black garbage bags in the middle of a freezing December night. She drove me to the worst part of town and left me on my aunt's doorstep. For years, she told the neighbors and our extended family that I was an uncontrollable, troubled runaway. She spun a narrative that I had chosen to leave completely, washing her hands of me to focus entirely on raising her golden child, Cameron. I spent my entire youth believing I was inherently unlovable, broken, and unworthy of a real family. But I survived. I put myself through college, working 3 jobs, and eventually built one of the most successful financial auditing and forensics firms in the country. I tracked down hidden assets and exposed corporate fraud for a living. Suddenly, a few months ago, after my firm was featured in a major business magazine, Beatrice and Cameron reappeared in my life. They claimed they had done a lot of soul-searching. They cried. They apologized. They invited me on this lavish Bahamas trip to heal our past wounds. And like a fool desperate for the maternal love I had been denied my entire life, I believed them. I audit fraudsters for a living, but I completely missed the con happening in my own family because I wanted a mother so badly. I looked at my mother now, seeing the cold, calculating greed in her eyes. "You did not invite me here to heal anything," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "You invited my bank accounts. You brought me here to fund your luxury lifestyle because Cameron cannot hold down a job, and you have burned through whatever money you had left." Beatrice stood up, her face twisting with rage. "Do not you dare speak to us that way. You are a bitter, lonely woman, Savannah. We are the only family you have, and you should be grateful we are even willing to look at you." I could not listen to another word. The oppressive heat of the sun, combined with the suffocating reality of their betrayal, made me feel physically ill. I grabbed my phone from the table and walked away without looking back. I retreated into the master suite, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind me to block out the sound of Cameron's mocking laughter. The air conditioning inside washed over me, but it did nothing to cool the anger boiling in my veins. I walked out onto the suite's secondary private balcony overlooking the ocean. I leaned against the railing, gripping the metal so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to leave. I needed to pack my bags, get a cab to the airport, and fly back to Chicago. I was done trying to fix a family that only saw me as an ATM. Just as I was pulling up a travel app on my phone to look for the next flight out, a strange vibration startled me. It was not my personal phone. It was my secondary device, a heavily encrypted smartphone I carried strictly for handling highly sensitive corporate espionage cases. Nobody had that number except my lead investigators. I pulled the secure device from my pocket. The screen lit up with a single urgent text message from an international number I did not recognize. The text read, "Fly home immediately. Do not say anything to Beatrice or Cameron." It was signed Harrison Legal Counsel. My forensic mind immediately went into overdrive. This was a secure, unlisted channel. Whoever this Harrison was, he had bypassed multiple layers of encryption to reach me. The direct mention of my mother and brother made my blood run cold. This was not a corporate client reaching out. This was deeply personal, and the urgency in the message was palpable. A heavy sense of dread settled over my shoulders. My instincts, honed by years of uncovering hidden financial crimes and corporate sabotage, screamed at me that I was in immediate danger. I did not know who Harrison was, but I knew I could not stay in this resort another minute. I rushed back inside the bedroom, heading straight for the closet where I had stored my valuables. I knelt in front of the digital hotel safe and quickly punched in my 4-digit code. The mechanism clicked and the heavy metal door swung open. I reached inside to grab my passport and wallet. My hand met empty space. I blinked, confused, and pulled the safe door wider to let the light in. It was completely bare. My passport, my emergency cash, my backup credit cards. Everything was gone. Panic flared in my chest. I frantically checked my luggage, thinking perhaps I had moved things around in a jet-lagged haze, but my bags had been rifled through. The zippers were in the wrong positions. Someone had meticulously searched my belongings. Before I could process the violation of my privacy, a faint sound caught my attention. It was a voice coming from the adjoining room, seeping through the thin connecting door that separated my suite from my mother's. I crept quietly toward the door, pressing my ear against the painted wood. It was Beatrice. She was speaking on her cell phone, her tone completely devoid of the hysterical anger she had directed at me on the terrace just minutes ago. Now her voice was calm, calculating, and chillingly precise. "Yes," she whispered into the phone. "The passport is burned. I took care of it this morning. There is no way she can leave the island." I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly against my ribs, I thought she might hear it through the wall. Beatrice paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then she spoke again, delivering a sentence that would shatter my entire reality and set off a chain of events I could never have anticipated. "Her flight leaves in an hour," Beatrice said coldly. "By tomorrow she will officially be lost at sea." My name is Vanessa, and standing frozen against the connecting door of my Bahamian resort suite, I realized my own mother was planning my death. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating in the humid tropical heat. "By tomorrow she will officially be lost at sea." My chest tightened, and for a fraction of a second, The terrified 9-year-old girl inside me wanted to collapse onto the floor and weep. But that girl was gone. The woman standing in her place was a seasoned financial forensic investigator. I track ghosts for a living. I hunt down corrupt executives who try to hide their assets and disappear with millions of dollars. My mother thought she could make me disappear with a burned passport and a locked safe. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. The betrayal was so massive it bypassed my emotional processing entirely and triggered pure calculated survival instinct. I heard the sharp click of Patricia's designer heels moving away from the door, followed by the heavy thud of the main suite door closing. She was leaving to meet Brandon. I stood perfectly still and waited exactly 60 seconds to ensure she was gone. Then I turned the brass handle of the adjoining door. It was unlocked. I stepped into her suite. It smelled of expensive jasmine perfume, entitlement, and lies. I scanned the immaculate room, my eyes sweeping over the scattered designer luggage, the silk robes draped over chairs, and the empty champagne glasses. An iPad lay on the king-sized bed, carelessly tossed aside on the premium linens. I walked over and picked it up. The screen woke up, prompting a numeric passcode. I knew Patricia better than she realized. I knew her overwhelming vanity. I typed in the 4 digits of her birth year. The screen unlocked instantly, granting me total access to her digital footprint. I opened her email application, my eyes scanning the recent activity. The top draft was a message addressed to the local Bahamian authorities and the United States Embassy. The subject line read, "Urgent Missing American Citizen." I read the draft and my blood ran ice cold in my veins. It described a tragic, entirely fabricated scenario. It stated that her daughter Vanessa had been drinking heavily, became severely belligerent after a family argument, and took a small watercraft out alone in the middle of the night. It painted a picture of an unstable, reckless woman who had succumbed to her own poor choices. Reading the word unstable brought a sudden violent rush of bitter memories. It was the exact same word she had used 25 years ago. When I was 9 years old, shivering on my Aunt Marie's crumbling porch, with my clothes stuffed into black garbage bags, a police cruiser had pulled up. The officer had approached me, shining a harsh flashlight in my face, and asked me why I ran away from such a loving, supportive home. Patricia had already called them, crying fake dramatic tears, filing a runaway report to cover up the fact that she had deliberately thrown me out into the freezing snow. She controlled the narrative then, making me look like the problem so no one would ever question her cruelty. She was doing it again, just on a much larger, more lethal scale. It was a massive escalation of the exact same tactic. She was going to erase me legally and physically and play the grieving, heartbroken mother to the world. I forced myself to keep reading. I closed the email draft and opened her flight confirmation application. There it was in plain sight. 2 first-class tickets for Patricia and Brandon leaving for Chicago at 8 o'clock tonight. It was currently 2 in the afternoon. They were going to leave the island, claim I went missing during a late-night bender, and let the ocean take the blame for my disappearance. I set the iPad down exactly where I found it, ensuring not a single pixel was out of place, perfectly preserving the illusion that her plan was intact. I walked back into my suite and locked the connecting door. Panic tried to claw its way up my throat, threatening to paralyze me, but I forced it down. Panic gets people killed. In my line of work, dealing with high-stakes international corporate fraud and ruthless criminals, you never travel without a contingency plan. You always prepare for the worst-case scenario. I walked over to my leather work briefcase resting on the wooden luggage rack. I pulled out my pocket knife and sliced open the thick interior lining at the bottom of the bag. From the hidden compartment, I extracted a slim waterproof pouch. Inside was a secondary expedited United States passport, a thick stack of $100 bills, and a prepaid burner phone. I never thought I would need to use my extraction kit to escape my own mother and brother. I packed only the absolute essentials into a small canvas tote bag. I left my large suitcase, my clothes, my expensive jewelry, and my toiletries exactly as they were. Let them think I was completely unprepared and trapped in paradise. Let them think I was currently wandering the beach without a lifeline. I slipped on a pair of dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed straw hat, pulling the brim low over my face to obscure my features. I opened my suite door, checked the hallway, and stepped out. The resort was sprawling a maze of lush tropical gardens and winding stone paths that felt more like a gilded cage with every passing second. I avoided the main promenade and took the service corridors, moving quickly through the shadows of the massive palm trees. The tropical heat pressed against me, making it hard to breathe, but I felt nothing but a cold, driving determination. As I neared the grand lobby, the rhythmic sound of a steel drum band masked my footsteps. Then I heard a familiar, obnoxious voice cutting through the music. It was Brandon. He was leaning against the marble concierge desk, loudly demanding a dinner reservation at a fully booked restaurant, waving his hands with his usual unearned arrogance. I pressed my back against a stone pillar, holding my breath. He was no more than 20 feet away. If he turned his head, he would see me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I waited, counting the agonizing seconds until the concierge pointed toward a map on the desk, drawing Brandon's attention away from the corridor. Seizing the moment, I slipped through a pair of swinging wooden doors marked for staff only. The service exit led me directly to the resort's back docks, where local fishermen brought in the morning catch for the hotel restaurants. The smell of salt air, seaweed, and heavy diesel fuel was a sharp contrast to the perfumed, sterile lobby I had just escaped. I scanned the chaotic dock area and spotted an older man untying a weathered motorboat from the wooden pylons. I approached him quickly, constantly checking over my shoulder to ensure I had not been followed by resort security. I pulled $500 bills from my pocket and held them out. "I need to get to the international airport right now," I told him, keeping my voice low and urgent. "I need to bypass the main roads and get there as fast as this boat can move." The fisherman looked at the cash, then up at my face, sensing the absolute desperation radiating from me. He did not ask any questions. He simply nodded, silently took the money, and gestured for me to step aboard his vessel. I climbed into the boat, gripping the side rail as the small engine roared to life with a puff of dark smoke. We sped away from the resort docks, the boat slicing aggressively through the turquoise water. The sea spray hit my face cool and sharp, waking me up and washing away the suffocating feeling of Patricia's suite. I pulled the burner phone from my bag and powered it on, my mind already calculating my next moves. I needed to reach Harrison. I needed to understand what was waiting for me in Chicago and why my family was suddenly willing to commit murder by proxy. As the boat curved around the rocky peninsula, I looked back at the luxurious resort fading into the distance. High up on the winding driveway leading to the main gates, I saw a black luxury SUV pulling away. It was the private car service Patricia always used. They were heading to the airport for their flight, fully believing their problem was solved. I watched the car shrink to a tiny speck, a fierce protective anger burning in my chest. They thought they had stranded me. They thought they had won. But they had just started a war they could never possibly win. The 30 hours of travel had been a grueling, paranoia-fueled marathon of delayed flights, cramped layovers, and stale airport coffee. I had bounced from a small, questionable charter plane in the Caribbean to a crowded commercial flight out of Miami, constantly looking over my shoulder and analyzing every passenger who walked down the aisle. My forensic mind was running on fumes, calculating variables, and mapping out exactly how I would access my secure servers the moment I reached my apartment in downtown Chicago. I had utilized a secondary expedited passport under a slightly altered professional alias, a backup protocol I designed specifically for international corporate espionage cases. I never imagined I would need to use it to escape my own mother. My body ached from sleeping in plastic terminal chairs, and I was running purely on adrenaline and a cold, burning fury. I just needed to get home. As I walked out of Gate 24 at O'Hare International Airport, the familiar chill of the Chicago air conditioning hit my face. I adjusted the brim of my straw hat and pulled my dark sunglasses up, trying to blend in with the tired business travelers and vacationers returning to reality. The concourse was a chaotic sea of rolling luggage, shouting families, and blaring overhead announcements. I expected a quiet exit. I expected to slip into the city unseen, catch a discreet cab, and become a ghost preparing to financially dismantle the people who tried to strand me. I was entirely wrong. The moment I crossed the threshold into the main arrivals concourse, a solid wall of navy blue blocked my path. Two uniformed police officers stepped squarely in front of me, their hands resting casually but purposefully near their utility belts. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a hammer. I froze instantly, my grip tightening on the strap of my canvas tote bag until my knuckles ached. My mind raced through a dozen terrible rapid-fire scenarios. Had Patricia realized I escaped? Had she framed me for a crime in the Bahamas to have me arrested upon entry? Had Border Patrol flagged my secondary passport? Before I could pivot or speak, two more men stepped out from behind a large digital advertising kiosk, cutting off any avenue of escape. One was a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled gray trench coat projecting the unmistakable weary aura of a seasoned city detective. The other was an elderly man in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. He carried a battered leather briefcase and possessed a sharp assessing gaze that immediately locked onto mine, tracking my micro-expressions. "Vanessa," the elderly man said, his voice carrying a quiet, commanding authority that cut through the ambient noise of the airport. "Do not run, we are here to help you." I took a rigid step back, my muscles tensing for a physical altercation. "I investigate corporate criminals, embezzlers, and fraudsters for a living. I do not trust strangers waiting in ambush at airport gates. I do not know you," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and devoid of fear. "Step aside right now, or I will start screaming and make a scene you cannot control." The man in the trench coat held up his hands in a placating, non-threatening gesture. He reached into his coat pocket slowly and flashed a gold shield. "I am Detective Russo, Chicago Police Department, and this gentleman is Arthur Harrison. He is an attorney. We have been waiting for your flight for 6 hours." I scoffed, my adrenaline spiking higher. "My mother has enough money to buy corrupt lawyers and rent fake cops. How much is she paying you to drag me back to her?" Harrison did not flinch at the insult. He took one deliberate step closer, lowering his voice, so only I could hear him over the din of passing travelers. "Patricia is not paying me a single dime, Vanessa. I know what she did to you. I know about December 14th, 25 years ago. The date hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The air rushed out of my lungs, leaving me momentarily breathless. That was the exact night Patricia had packed my life into black garbage bags, driven me to the worst neighborhood in the city, and abandoned me on my impoverished aunt's freezing porch. It was a detail I had buried deep in the darkest corners of my mind, a date I never shared with anyone, not even my most trusted lead investigators. Harrison kept his eyes locked on mine, his expression softening with a strange, sorrowful empathy that disarmed my immediate aggression. "I know it was 10 degrees that night," he continued softly, his words precise and devastating. "I know you were wearing a thin, torn red coat because Patricia refused to buy you a proper winter jacket. I know she told the police you ran away to cover her own tracks. I know she has spent your entire life trying to manipulate everyone into believing you are a broken, unstable liability." My defensive walls cracked, shattering under the weight of my own validated history. No one knew about the red coat. Not the police, not the neighbors, and certainly not my brother Brandon. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling for the absolute first time since I fled the island. "I am the man who has been trying to find you for nearly 2 decades, Harrison replied, his tone heavy with regret. "And right now, we need to get you out of public view immediately. Your life depends on it." I allowed them to escort me away from the crowded concourse, my mind spinning with unanswerable questions. Detective Russo led us down a restricted employee-only hallway, swiping a security keycard to grant us access to a sterile, windowless airport security room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, completely sealing us off from the noise of the terminal. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. I took a seat at a cold metal table, pulling my tote bag onto my lap and hugging it to my chest like a shield. Harrison sat across from me, placing his leather briefcase on the table with a heavy thud. Russo stood guard by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes scanning the hallway through a small sliver of reinforced glass. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was completely silent. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion carved into Harrison's face. When he finally spoke, his guarded professional demeanor melted away entirely, replaced by a profound, overwhelming relief. "Thank God you are alive, Vanessa," he breathed, closing his eyes and letting out a long, ragged sigh. I stared at him, my forensic mind struggling to process his extreme reaction. "I am alive," I stated flatly, leaning forward. "Why would I not be? Patricia left me without a passport or money, but she knows perfectly well that I am resourceful. She was just trying to strand me in a foreign country to teach me a lesson and assert her dominance." Harrison opened his eyes and shook his head slowly. "This is not about stranding you, Vanessa. This is not another one of her cruel, petty psychological games." He reached into his briefcase, his hands slightly trembling, and pulled out a thick manila file folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the metal table. "Your mother just filed your death certificate." The words hung in the sterile air, cold and lethal. I felt the blood rapidly drain from my face. The metal room spun slightly, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. "A death certificate." I repeated the syllables, feeling heavy and entirely foreign on my tongue. "How is that even legally possible? I have only been gone for 30 hours. Russo spoke up from his post by the door, his tone grim and matter-of-fact. "Your mother and brother returned to Chicago on an expedited private flight yesterday evening. They bypassed standard customs and went straight to the federal authorities. They filed a sworn, notarized affidavit claiming you had a severe mental break, drank heavily, stole a local boat, and vanished into the ocean during a sudden tropical squall. They provided fabricated witnesses from the resort staff." Russo continued, disgust lacing his words. "With their money and social influence, they greased the wheels of international bureaucracy. They had a corrupt judge fast-track the declaration of death in absentia this morning. As far as the United States government is concerned, Vanessa, you drowned yesterday." My mind raced at terrifying speeds, piecing together the timeline. The destroyed passport, the hacked iPad. The missing person report I had found on Patricia's device was just the precursor to the ultimate lie. They had orchestrated a seamless, legally binding narrative to erase me from the face of the earth without firing a single bullet. But why, I asked, my voice rising with a volatile mixture of terror and absolute unrestrained fury. Why go to such massive illegal lengths? She already kicked me out when I was a child. She already ruined my youth. Why does she need me legally dead? Harrison unlocked the brass clasp of the file folder and pushed it across the table toward me. He tapped a manicured finger against the top page. The document was heavily redacted, stamped with official federal seals and blue legal watermarks. "She is not just trying to erase you, Vanessa," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a somber, devastating whisper. "She is using your declared death to claim the $50 million trust your biological father left you. A trust she has kept hidden for 19 years. I stared at the redacted file resting on the cold metal table. $50 million. My biological father was a ghost in my memory, a man Patricia claimed had selfishly abandoned us before I could even walk. Now Harrison was telling me he was a multi-millionaire who had tried to secure my future." Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands deliberately over his battered leather briefcase. "Your father, Arthur Sterling, passed away 19 years ago." He said, his voice low and steady. "You were 15 at the time. He left a comprehensive estate plan with one primary beneficiary, you. But Patricia was listed as your legal guardian. She intercepted the legal notifications. She signed the preliminary probate documents on your behalf, sealing the records under a privacy injunction before you ever knew they existed." My mind spun furiously, aligning dates and memories. 19 years ago, I was working double shifts at a greasy diner just to pay for my own high school textbooks and winter boots. Meanwhile, Patricia and Brandon were suddenly taking luxury ski vacations to Aspen and buying brand new luxury vehicles. I had always assumed Patricia had found another wealthy mark to foot the bill. Now the pieces locked together with sickening clarity. It was my money, they were spending my money. The revelation triggered a much darker, far more sinister realization. I looked at Detective Russo, my breath catching in my throat. The night she kicked me out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was 9 years old. She packed my bags and left me on my Aunt Marie's porch in the dead of winter. Then she called the police and reported me as a runaway. Russo nodded grimly from his post by the heavy steel door. We pulled the old precinct files this morning, Vanessa. Patricia created a massive, highly documented paper trail portraying you as a severely troubled flight risk child. She claimed you refused to live under her roof and were dangerously unstable. The forensic auditor inside me saw the entire architecture of the fraud laid out in perfect, horrifying detail. It was not just maternal cruelty, it was a calculated long-term legal strategy. By establishing me as a volatile runaway who refused contact, Patricia justified maintaining total control over the auxiliary interest of the trust. She collected the massive monthly dividends for decades, claiming to the courts that she was holding the funds for an estranged daughter she could not locate. But why now? I demanded, my hands gripping the edge of the table so hard my fingers ached. Why orchestrate this massive fake death in the Bahamas now? We have not spoken in years before this sudden reconciliation trip. Harrison flipped to the second page of the redacted file, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. Because of the distribution clause in Arthur Sterling's trust, the auxiliary dividends were capped. The actual principal, the full $50 million, was locked in an untouchable federal holding account. It automatically vests and transfers to your sole control on your 35th birthday. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. My 35th birthday is next Friday, exactly 7 days away. Precisely, Harrison said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. Once you turn 35, Patricia loses access to the dividends and she never touches the principal. But if you are legally declared dead before that date, the trust defaults to your next of kin. Since you are unmarried and have no children, that $50 million defaults directly to your mother. The Bahamas trip was not a reconciliation. It was a meticulously planned execution. Patricia needed me in international waters. She needed to steal my passport so I could not board a commercial flight. She needed me stranded, isolated, and untraceable. She had undoubtedly paid off local authorities or resort staff to corroborate her fabricated story about my supposed drunken, unstable behavior. She framed my disappearance perfectly to ensure the Chicago probate courts would expedite the death certificate before my birthday arrived. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal crashed over me like a physical tidal wave. My mother had not just hated me. She had farmed me for cash. She had let me starve, let me sleep on a freezing porch, let me struggle for every single thing I had ever achieved, all while sitting on a fortune that belonged to me. And when the time came for me to finally receive what was mine, she decided it was easier to wipe me off the face of the earth than to let me have it. The walls of the sterile airport security room began to warp and stretch. A high-pitched ringing sound drowned out the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I tried to stand up, wanting to pace, wanting to scream, but my legs felt like solid lead. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely depleted of oxygen. Vanessa Russo said, his voice sounding as though it were coming from underwater. "Are you all right?" I reached out to grip the edge of the metal table to steady myself, but my fingers slipped. Black spots danced aggressively across my vision. The faces of Harrison and the detective blurred into indistinct shadows. The 19 years of lies, the stolen money, the fake tears, the Bahamas trap. It was too much for my exhausted body to process. The floor rushed up to meet me, and then there was nothing but heavy, suffocating darkness. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The smell of industrial airport cleaner had been replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of clinical antiseptic. I blinked against the harsh overhead lights, my vision slowly coming into focus. I was lying in a narrow hospital bed in a small, windowless room. A clear tube snaked down from a plastic bag above me, feeding a clear liquid into a needle taped securely to the back of my hand. I turned my head. Detective Russo was sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the room, scrolling through a secure tablet. He looked up immediately when the rhythm of the monitor changed. "You are in the medical bay of a federal holding facility," Russo said, standing up and approaching the side of the bed. You collapsed in the airport. The doctors said it was a combination of severe dehydration, extreme physical exhaustion, and clinical shock. You have been unconscious for nearly 4 hours. I tried to sit up, my head pounding with a dull, rhythmic ache. My mother, I croaked, my throat feeling like sandpaper. The trust. Harrison is monitoring the probate court dockets as we speak, Russo assured me, holding up a hand to stop me from moving too quickly. But right now, we need to focus on your safety. Patricia and Brandon believe you are dead. If they find out you bypassed their trap and made it back to Chicago, they will panic. Desperate people with $50 million on the line are highly dangerous. Russo pulled a secondary file from his dark jacket pocket. I have already spoken with the federal prosecutor. Given the massive financial magnitude of the fraud and the international elements of your attempted endangerment, we have grounds to place you in protective custody immediately. We want to move you to a secure safe house outside the state. We will initiate a formal witness protection protocol until we can build a rock-solid indictment against your mother and brother. I stared at the detective, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Hide? Run away. Let the authorities handle it while I sit quietly in a safe house. That was the logical safe option. That was the exact option Patricia would expect me to take if I had survived. But Patricia had spent 25 years dictating the terms of my existence. She had controlled the narrative. She had played the victim while systematically stealing my future. She thought she could simply sign a piece of paper, shed a few fake tears, and erase Vanessa Sterling from the world. A cold, absolute calm washed over me completely, overriding the physical exhaustion in my bones. I reached over with my free hand, grabbed the medical tape securing the intravenous line to my skin, and ripped it off in one swift, violent motion. "What are you doing?" Russo demanded, stepping forward with a look of genuine alarm. "You need those fluids." I ignored the small bead of blood welling up on the back of my hand. I swung my legs over the side of the narrow bed and planted my feet firmly on the cold linoleum floor. I stood up, ignoring the slight wave of dizziness, and locked my eyes onto the detective. The terrified, abandoned 9-year-old girl was permanently dead. In her place was a top-tier forensic auditor who was about to dismantle her enemies piece by piece. "No!" I said, my voice hardening into pure steel. "I am not going into a safe house. I am not running away." Russo frowned, shifting his weight to block my path to the door. "Vanessa, you have to understand the extreme risk here. If Patricia realizes you are alive, she will accelerate her plans." I cut him off, stepping directly into his personal space with unyielding authority. "Then we make sure she does not realize it. Let her think I am dead. Let her think her grand plan worked flawlessly. Let her think she is completely untouchable. I want to see exactly how far they are willing to go." I did not wait for Detective Russo to argue the point. The sheer, unyielding force of my command left him temporarily speechless, rooted to the spot in the sterile medical bay. Within the hour, I was discharged against all medical advice. Flanked by armed federal escorts and shielded by the shadows of a customized transport van, I was driven through the labyrinthine subterranean tunnels of downtown Chicago directly to Harrison's private legal stronghold. The off-the-grid office was an absolute fortress, hidden behind the crumbling, unassuming brick facade of a defunct textile warehouse in the industrial district. The interior was a masterclass in modern paranoia and high-level digital security. Heavy steel reinforced doors sealed us inside. Localized cellular jammers blocked any unauthorized outbound signals. A massive bank of high-speed liquid-cooled servers hummed in the background with a low, predatory vibration. It was exactly the kind of black site environment my forensic auditing firm utilized for deep-cover corporate investigations and exposing international syndicates. Now I was using this state-of-the-art bunker to dissect my own family. The physical toll of my 30-hour escape from the Bahamas attempted to drag me down, but I pushed the exhaustion aside, fueled entirely by pure, concentrated vengeance. I took a seat at the main terminal, the glow of the massive curved monitors illuminating the cold resolve in my eyes. I cracked my knuckles, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room, and commandeered the keyboard. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys. I bypassed the standard firewalls of my own company, Vanguard Financial Forensics, with practiced ease. I had built the network architecture myself from the ground up. I knew every hidden backdoor, every blind spot, and every digital tripwire embedded in the code. Within minutes, I successfully tapped into the closed-circuit television feeds of my corporate headquarters located in the heart of the financial district. The high-definition screens blinked to life in vibrant color, displaying the polished glass and chrome lobby of my firm. The digital timestamp in the corner indicated it was 10 in the morning, exactly 48 hours after I had supposedly drowned in a tragic alcohol-fueled boating accident in the Bahamian Sea. The heavy glass front doors of my firm slid open and my stomach churned. There he was. Brandon. He was not wearing the wrinkled, casual linen shirts he favored on his forced island vacation. He was draped in a bespoke charcoal Italian suit. His hair was meticulously styled. He strode across the marble floor, projecting the absolute unearned arrogance of a conquering king claiming his new territory. He did not look like a grieving man who had just lost his only sister to a terrible accident. He looked like a man who had just won a massive lottery jackpot. I tracked his movements through the building's internal cameras as he walked past my grieving reception staff. He did not offer them a single glance of empathy or a word of comfort. He made a direct, purposeful line for the executive boardroom on the top floor. Using the forensic infiltration software provided by Harrison's secure servers, I hacked into the boardroom's integrated conference microphone system. I patched the live audio feed directly into my secure headset, pressing the earpieces tightly against my head. Brandon stood confidently at the head of the massive mahogany table looking down at my board of directors. These were men and women I had personally vetted, brilliant minds who were currently visibly shaken and devastated by the sudden news of my declared death. Brandon placed both hands flat on the polished table, bowing his head in a perfectly rehearsed, sickening display of profound sorrow. "I know this is a devastating shock to all of us," Brandon said, his voice thick with a fake trembling emotion that made my blood boil. Vanessa was a visionary leader. But the financial market does not wait for our grief. As her sole surviving blood relative and the legal executor of her immediate estate, I am officially stepping in as your interim chief executive officer. I am here to save my dear departed sister's legacy. The sheer audacity of his performance hit me like a physical strike to the jaw. He was not there to save my legacy. He was there to illegally absorb my multi-million-dollar firm, liquidate its hard-earned assets, and aggressively fund his parasitic, lavish lifestyle. As I listened to him spin his toxic web of lies to my board, a visceral, agonizing memory clawed its way to the surface of my mind. It was an action-based repetition of our dark past. I was a junior in high school. I had spent 6 agonizing months compiling complex atmospheric data for the highly competitive district science fair. I stayed up until dawn for weeks, meticulously mapping weather patterns and building comprehensive presentation boards. On the morning of the final presentation, my project vanished from the school laboratory. Hours later, I walked into the crowded gymnasium only to find Brandon standing proudly beside my exact data. He had brazenly plastered his own name across the top of my research in bold block letters. He presented my months of grueling work as his own genius and won the district gold medal. When I had tearfully confronted Patricia in the school hallway, she just smiled tightly, gripped my shoulder with punishing force, and hissed in my ear. "Brandon needs this academic win for his college applications. Be a supportive sister for once in your miserable life and keep your mouth shut." He had stolen my academic achievements back then, using my actual blood and sweat to elevate his own pathetic status while Patricia actively held me down. Now, 19 years later, he was trying to steal my entire corporate empire using the exact same calculated playbook. He was presenting my life's work to the world as his own personal safety net. Not this time. I removed my headset, letting it drop onto the desk. The sound of his fake mourning sickened me beyond words. I turned my attention back to the cascading lines of code on my monitors and went fully on the offensive. I became the absolute ghost in the machine. First, I targeted his administrative access, utilizing my ultimate superuser privileges, a fail-safe command prompt. I had secretly embedded deeply in the core code during the company's founding. I immediately revoked his newly minted executive credentials. The security system flagged his profile as hostile, forcefully stripping away his ability to view client ledgers, access employee payroll, or read any internal communications. But simply locking him out of the company intranet was not enough punishment. I needed to ensure he could not touch a single solitary penny of my operational capital. Brandon was incredibly greedy, but he was also fundamentally stupid when it came to navigating complex financial structures. He assumed that possessing a fraudulent death certificate automatically granted him unrestricted keys to my kingdom. He completely underestimated the labyrinth of corporate law and my own ruthless preparation. I executed a severe contingency protocol I had designed specifically for hostile corporate takeover scenarios. With a series of heavily encrypted keystrokes, I initiated a total irreversible asset freeze. I systematically rerouted Vanguard Financial's entire volume of liquid capital. Tens of millions of dollars transferred silently and instantaneously from our vulnerable public commercial accounts into a series of highly secure federal holding accounts. I linked these untouchable holding accounts directly to Harrison's private off-the-grid trust ledger. It required my living biometric signature to release even a fraction of a dime. I watched the boardroom security feed intently as my chief financial officer looked down at her tablet, her brow furrowing in deep, sudden confusion. I knew exactly what she was seeing on her screen. The company accounts had just flatlined to absolute zero. Brandon continued to speak to the board, completely oblivious to the fact that he was now the interim CEO of a financially paralyzed empty shell. I did not stop my digital assault there. I needed to isolate my mother and brother completely. I accessed the personal retail banking network Patricia and Brandon shared. I utilized my forensic software to forcefully flag their primary checking and savings accounts for highly suspicious international wire transfers, citing their recent unexplained activity in the Bahamas as a critical risk factor. It was an automated algorithmic trigger that required zero human oversight to initiate. The banking algorithms performed their ruthless duty instantly. Every single checking account, savings account, and premium credit card linked to their names was instantly suspended pending a thorough, lengthy federal financial review. I leaned back in the ergonomic leather chair, watching the verification prompts fill my screens with a cold, terrifying satisfaction. The trap was perfectly set, completely invisible to the naked eye, just waiting for them to step blindly onto the digital trigger. 2 hours later, Brandon finally left my corporate office building. He strutted out of the revolving glass doors with his head held high, radiating the toxic, unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed he had just inherited the entire world. I tracked his personal cellular location using a localized ping interceptor software on Harrison's network. He did not go home to comfort his supposedly grieving mother. He went directly to the Gold Coast, marching straight into an ultra-exclusive exotic car dealership. I pulled up the dealership's external and internal security feeds, zooming in tightly on his exact location on the showroom floor. Brandon was pacing excitedly around a sleek, low-slung midnight black sports car. The illuminated price tag resting on the pristine dashboard clearly read $300,000. He was already eagerly spending the money he incorrectly assumed he had legally stolen from my corpse. He flagged down an eager salesman, gesturing wildly to the beautiful vehicle, and arrogantly tossed his premium black credit card onto the salesman's glass desk. I watched the salesman pick up the card, his customer service smile incredibly bright and accommodating. He swiped the magnetic strip through the point-of-sale terminal. The machine beeped loudly, flashing a harsh, unmistakable red light. The salesman frowned, apologizing profusely to Brandon, and ran the card through the machine a second time. Another solid red light. Brandon's arrogant, victorious smile faltered slightly. He snatched the plastic card back, rummaged aggressively through his designer leather wallet, and slapped a secondary platinum card onto the glass desk. The salesman swiped it. Declined. Brandon threw down a third card, his face rapidly flushing a deep mottled red as other customers began to stare. Declined. I watched through this high-definition camera lens as absolute panic finally breached his impenetrable ego. He snatched his useless plastic cards off the desk and stormed out of the dealership, violently pushing past the confused salesman. He stood alone on the busy Chicago sidewalk, his chest heaving rapidly as the severe reality of his situation began to close in around him. I intercepted the outgoing cellular signal as he frantically dialed Patricia's number. The audio patched directly into my secure network, ringing crystal clear through the speakers in Harrison's bunker. "Mom!" Brandon gasped, his voice tight, shrill, and trembling with absolute terror. "The money is gone! Someone is locking us out!" I listened through the encrypted audio feed as dead silence stretched across the line. Patricia did not scream. She did not panic. When she finally spoke, her voice was a venomous hiss that made the hairs on my arms stand up despite the warm, ambient temperature of the server room. "Get a grip on yourself, Brandon. The bank is just running a standard security protocol because we traveled internationally. Stop acting like a hysterical child and get back to the hotel. We are moving up the timeline. Do not speak to anyone." She terminated the call with a sharp click. I watched Brandon's GPS signal ping erratically on the digital map as he practically sprinted away from the exotic car dealership, his dreams of instant luxury temporarily dashed against the concrete wall of my digital firewall. Harrison, Detective Russo, and I spent the next 48 hours buried in the subterranean bunker, tracking every single digital breadcrumb my family left behind. The physical exhaustion of my escape had finally caught up with me, but I refused to sleep for more than a few hours at a time on the small cot in the corner of the server room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patricia's manicured hand sliding that massive yacht bill across the glass table. I heard her cold voice ordering my execution. So I stayed awake. I monitored their panicked communications. Patricia and Brandon were bleeding cash they did not have, desperately maxing out secondary credit lines and calling in favors from elite socialites just to keep up appearances. They needed liquid capital, and they needed it immediately to maintain their wealthy facade. Then on Tuesday morning, the local news networks interrupted their regular broadcasting. I sat forward in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes locking onto the massive curved monitor in Harrison's office as the breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Patricia had called a press conference. She stood at a podium outside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago, dressed in immaculate, understated black designer clothing. Brandon stood loyally at her shoulder, his head bowed, looking suitably grim and devastated. It was a masterclass in theatrical presentation. Patricia leaned into the cluster of microphones, taking a shaky, perfectly timed breath. "My heart is entirely shattered," she said, her voice catching flawlessly on the syllables. She raised a trembling hand, clutching a monogrammed tissue to wipe away a single meticulously manufactured tear. "My beautiful daughter Vanessa was a brilliant woman who tragically succumbed to the heavy burdens of her own mind. We tried for years to get her the help she so desperately needed. To lose her to the ocean, to know she was suffering so deeply in her final moments, it is a pain no mother should ever have to endure." My blood turned to absolute ice. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy radiating from the screen was breathtaking. She was not just killing me. She was assassinating my character posthumously to ensure no one would ever look too closely at the circumstances of my death. I had seen those exact same tears before. When I was 9 years old, just hours after she had physically shoved me out the back door into a blinding Chicago blizzard, a social worker from Child Protective Services had arrived at my Aunt Marie's house to investigate the disturbance call. I was sitting in the precinct wrapped in a foil thermal blanket, my lips literally blue from the freezing temperatures. Patricia burst into the police station like a hurricane of maternal distress. She did not rush to comfort me. She ran straight to the social worker and collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. She wept with the exact same theatrical devastation I was watching on the monitor right now. She sobbed about how uncontrollable I was, how I constantly ran away, how she was a terrified, exhausted single mother, doing her absolute best with a deeply disturbed, volatile child. She used those fake tears to completely neutralize the authorities. She manipulated the narrative so flawlessly that the police ended up comforting her while looking at me with deep suspicion. She convinced them I was a danger to myself and that she was the victim. They believed her. They always believed her. Harrison muted the television, his face drawn tight with absolute disgust. "She is accelerating the probate process," he said, turning to his laptop and pulling up the highly restricted county court dockets. "Your mother is a master manipulator. By turning your disappearance into a high-profile media tragedy, she is applying immense public pressure on the legal system." Russo leaned against the steel-reinforced door, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "How does a press conference help her get the trust money faster? Does she not have to wait for a standard waiting period before a death in absentia is legally recognized?" "Normally, yes," Harrison explained, his fingers flying across his keyboard as he pulled up Patricia's recent federal filings. "But judges are elected officials, and they absolutely hate bad press. Patricia just filed an emergency petition for the immediate release of the trust principal. She is claiming that Vanguard Financials is currently experiencing a catastrophic liquidity crisis because of your sudden death." I stared at the muted screen, watching Patricia hug Brandon for the cameras. It was a brilliantly evil legal maneuver. By freezing their accounts and locking Brandon out of my company's capital, I had unintentionally given her the perfect excuse to demand expedited access to the trust. She was weaponizing my own counterstrike against me. She was claiming the company was failing without me, and she needed the trust money to save my employees from financial ruin. Harrison pulled up a heavily redacted, sealed legal document on the main screen. "The probate judge assigned to your case is Judge Thomas Sterling. He is notoriously sympathetic to high-profile grieving families. Patricia has requested a special expedited hearing under the guise of an emergency corporate bailout. If Sterling signs the final death declaration and the trust release order, the $50 million automatically transfers to Patricia's offshore holding accounts. Once that money crosses international borders into those unregulated tax havens, it is effectively gone. We will spend a decade navigating international financial courts, trying to recover it." "When is the hearing?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, my eyes never leaving Patricia's face on the screen. "That is the exact problem," Harrison replied, running a hand over his tired face. "There is no formal courtroom hearing scheduled. Patricia just announced the details to the press." He reached over and unmuted the television. Patricia was leaning back into the microphones, clutching her crumpled tissue to her chest. "To honor my daughter's incredible life and her vast contributions to the financial sector, Brandon and I will be hosting a celebration of life memorial this coming Saturday evening. It will be held at the Oak Brook Country Club. We invite Vanessa's colleagues, friends, and the entire community to join us in saying our final goodbyes to my sweet, troubled girl. We want to celebrate her legacy properly before we take on the heavy burden of managing her affairs." Harrison paused the broadcast, freezing Patricia's perfectly manufactured expression of tragic grief on the massive monitor. "Judge Sterling is a prominent founding member of the Oak Brook Country Club," Harrison stated flatly, tapping the screen. "Patricia is not just throwing a memorial service. She is throwing a highly publicized, extensively catered gala to trap the judge in front of the city's absolute elite. She is going to have him sign the final trust release documents right there at the reception, surrounded by sympathetic witnesses, weeping family friends, and flashing cameras. It is a completely airtight legal ambush. She knows he will not deny a grieving mother in front of his wealthy peers." Russo shook his head in disbelief, stepping away from the door. "If she gets that signature on Saturday, she wins entirely. She gets the $50 million, she liquidates your forensic firm on Monday morning to cover her tracks, and she disappears into thin air. Vanessa, we have enough evidence of financial fraud to arrest Brandon right now for the stunt he pulled at your office. We can take them both into custody for the bank fraud and officially halt the probate process before Saturday arrives." "No," I said instantly, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. Russo frowned, stepping toward the table. "Vanessa, if we wait until Saturday, we risk losing the entire trust. Once that judge's ink hits the paper, the automated wire transfers will initiate. It is too dangerous to let this play out. If we arrest them now for minor financial crimes, they will post bail in an hour. I countered my mind operating with the surgical, ruthless precision that had made me the top forensic investigator in the city. Patricia will spin the arrest as a massive misunderstanding, fueled by her intense grief. She will use her high-priced lawyers to drag the trust litigation out in civil court for a decade. She will tie me up in endless legal battles claiming I faked my own death to intentionally torture her and ruin her reputation. I do not want to just stop her from getting the money, detective. I want to utterly destroy her. I turned to Harrison, feeling the familiar icy focus settle over my senses. Can you get us full security access to the Oak Brook Country Club on Saturday night? I need complete infiltration of their audio and visual systems, and I need unrestricted access to the main ballroom. Harrison smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his weathered face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a solid gold money clip. I am a platinum member, Vanessa. I have been for 30 years. I can get us absolutely anywhere we need to go without triggering a single alarm. Good, I said, looking back at the frozen image of my mother's fake tear-stained face on the monitor, the same face that had condemned me to freeze on a porch 25 years ago. The same face that had calmly ordered my death in a tropical paradise. She wanted to play the grieving mother. She wanted to throw a lavish high society party to celebrate stealing my entire life and erasing my existence. Let her throw the party. I have the perfect eulogy planned. Get a grip on yourself, Brandon, Patricia hissed through the intercepted cellular audio feed. Her voice was pure venom, entirely devoid of the manufactured grief she planned to display to the world. The bank is just running a standard security protocol because we traveled internationally. Stop acting like a hysterical child. If the digital accounts are temporarily frozen, you need to pivot and secure the physical assets immediately. Go back to her firm, hire private security contractors, evict her staff, strip the physical servers, and sell whatever hardware you can liquidate today. We need operating capital to keep up appearances until the probate judge signs the trust release. The line went dead with a sharp electronic click. I sat back in the ergonomic leather chair inside Harrison's subterranean bunker, the soft blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. Beside me, Detective Russo pushed off the concrete wall, his hand resting instinctively on his duty belt. "He is going to forcefully enter your building," Russo said, his voice tight with professional alarm. "I can dispatch 3 marked cruiser units to your corporate headquarters right now. We can have Brandon and his hired muscle arrested for criminal trespassing and attempted burglary before they even cross the lobby threshold." I held up a hand, stopping the detective in his tracks. "No. If you send uniformed police, Brandon will play the victim. He will wave my fraudulent death certificate in their faces and claim he is a grieving brother trying to manage his deceased sister's chaotic estate. The police might be forced to stand down due to the legal ambiguity of the probate timeline. I am not going to let him control the narrative. I built that firm to be a fortress. I will handle this myself." Vanguard Financial Forensics was not just a business to me. It was my sanctuary. When Patricia had locked me out in the snow at 9 years old, I had sworn I would never be vulnerable again. I had built Vanguard from absolutely nothing. I remembered the early years sleeping under my cramped metal desk, surviving on cheap black coffee and raw ambition while I decoded complex financial syndicates. My employees were not just analysts or administrative staff. They were brilliant, fiercely loyal individuals who had stood by me through grueling federal audits and dangerous corporate investigations. They were my chosen family. I absolutely refused to let a parasite like Brandon terrorize them. I turned back to the massive server terminal, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. Before I locked down the physical building, I needed to ensure my highly sensitive client data was completely untouchable. I bypassed the standard firewalls and accessed the deepest layer of the Vanguard archival network. "Harrison?" I said, not taking my eyes off the cascading lines of code. "I am initiating an emergency data migration to your secure offsite servers. I am purging the local drives at Vanguard. I need you to verify the encryption protocols on your end." There are specific highly volatile client dossiers that Brandon cannot be allowed to access or weaponize under any circumstances. Harrison leaned over his own laptop, his weathered fingers tapping rapidly. Secure channel is open, Vanessa. Send the files. I executed the transfer commands, watching the progress bars illuminate the screen. I am sending them now. Verify receipt of the file named Duyan Mao, 1_12.docx. I waited for Harrison's nod before continuing. Next is Duyan Mao 2_12.docx. Then Duyan Mao 3_12.docx. And finally, Duyan Mao 4_12.docx. Ensure those 4 specific documents are buried behind military-grade encryption. If Brandon somehow manages to breach a physical hard drive, I want him to find absolutely nothing but empty code. Files received and locked down in the dark web vault, Harrison confirmed. Your local servers are now completely clean. Just in time, I murmured, bringing up the live exterior security feeds of the Vanguard building. 2 matte black tactical SUVs aggressively mounted the curb outside my corporate headquarters. The doors swung open and 6 massive men dressed in unmarked black tactical gear stepped out onto the Chicago sidewalk. They looked like private military contractors, precisely the kind of unregulated muscle Brandon would hire with credit he no longer possessed. Brandon emerged from the second vehicle, his bespoke Italian suit looking completely out of place among the hired thugs. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority, and led the charge toward the revolving glass doors. I switched the feed to the interior lobby cameras. The midday financial news played silently on the flat screens mounted behind the reception desk. My lead manager, David, a former Marine intelligence officer with a permanently stern expression, stood near the security turnstiles. He had clearly seen the SUVs pull up. Brandon marched into the lobby flanked by his imposing security detail. He clapped his hands together loudly, the sharp sound echoing across the marble floor. "Listen up, everyone," Brandon shouted, projecting his voice to ensure the entire ground floor could hear him. As the legal executor of Vanessa Sterling's estate, I am hereby dissolving Vanguard Financial Forensics. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. Anyone remaining after 10 minutes will be physically removed for trespassing. We are seizing all corporate hardware servers and physical assets immediately. David stepped forward, planting his feet firmly on the marble tile. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, completely unfazed by the 6 armed contractors standing behind Brandon. "You do not have the legal authority to dissolve this firm or seize its assets," David stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried perfectly over the hidden lobby microphones. "Until we receive a verified direct order from a federal probate judge, Vanguard Financial remains fully operational. You and your men need to leave the building." Brandon sneered, stepping aggressively into David's personal space. "My sister is dead. I own this building. I own these servers. I own you. If you do not step aside right now, I will have my security team throw you through that plate glass window." I watched the confrontation from the underground bunker, my blood running cold with calculated fury. He was trying to destroy the only home I had ever built for myself. He was trying to physically intimidate the people who had loyally protected my back for a decade. It was the exact same bullying tactic he had used when he stole my science fair project in high school, relying on brute force and Patricia's backing to crush anyone who stood in his way. I opened a secure encrypted chat window directly to David's personal smartphone. I typed a single rapid message. "David, it is Vanessa. I am alive. Evacuate the staff through the subterranean garage exit immediately. I am initiating the Fortress Protocol." Through the high-definition camera feed, I saw David's phone vibrate in his hand. He glanced down at the screen. I watched his eyes widen for a fraction of a second before his intense military training reasserted total control over his facial expressions. A subtle, dangerous smile ghosted across his lips. He looked back up at Brandon. "You know what, Brandon? You are absolutely right. The building is all yours." David turned smoothly on his heel and signaled to the reception staff and the visible security guards. "Everyone out. Move to the lower garage. Now." The Vanguard employees, confused but trusting David's absolute authority, quickly abandoned their desks and filed rapidly through the secure stairwell doors. Within 90 seconds, the expansive lobby was completely empty, leaving Brandon and his hired muscle standing alone in the center of the room. Brandon laughed loudly, a harsh, victorious sound that echoed through my headset. Look at them run. Cowards just like she was. All right, boys, fan out. I want the main server room breached first. Rip the hard drives out of the racks. We have buyers waiting. I placed my hands flat on the desk in the bunker. You do not own my legacy. Brandon, I whispered into the empty room. I hit the primary execution key. The Vanguard building was not a standard commercial property. I had retrofitted the architecture to withstand hostile corporate espionage and physical infiltration. When I engaged the Fortress Protocol, the building responded with terrifying, instantaneous violence. Massive steel-reinforced security shutters slammed down over the exterior windows, and the revolving glass doors sealing the lobby in near absolute darkness. The magnetic locks on every single interior door engaged with a synchronized heavy thud that shook the camera feeds. The elevators instantly powered down, dropping to the basement level and locking into place. The smart glass surrounding the main atrium frosted over completely, turning the transparent walls into opaque, impenetrable barriers. In the lobby, the emergency red lighting flared to life, casting harsh crimson shadows across the faces of the trapped men. The private security contractors instantly drew their weapons, spinning in circles, as they realized they were entirely caged in a steel box. What the hell is going on? Brandon screamed, his voice pitching upward in sudden, unadulterated panic. Open the doors! Open the doors! The contractors threw their weight against the main exit, but the heavy steel shutters did not budge a single millimeter. They were trapped in the primary sector with absolutely no way out and no cellular reception to call for backup. Brandon's arrogance evaporated, replaced instantly by the frantic desperation of a cornered rat. He spotted the heavy fire door leading to the secondary hallway, the only path that led toward the localized server farm. He pointed a shaking finger at the reinforced metal. Break it down. The servers are through there. If we get the hard drives, we can override the lockdown. Two of the largest contractors retrieved a heavy battering ram from their tactical bags. They slammed the heavy iron against the fire door. The sound echoed through the audio feed like cannon fire. 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes. The heavy hinges finally groaned and gave way, sending the door crashing to the linoleum floor. Brandon scrambled over the fallen door, sprinting frantically down the emergency-lit hallway. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit jacket hanging off his shoulders as he hyperventilated. He reached the double doors of the primary server room. This was the beating heart of Vanguard Financial Forensics. This was the room that housed the millions of dollars in proprietary hardware he desperately needed to sell to fund Patricia's grand escape. He threw open the double doors, rushing blindly into the dark room. The motion sensors detected his presence, and a single harsh white emergency spotlight snapped on overhead. Brandon stopped dead in his tracks, his chest heaving as he stared into the center of the room. He let out a low, strangled cry of absolute defeat. The massive floor-to-ceiling server racks were completely empty. Every single hard drive, every processor, and every flashing blade of memory had been meticulously stripped away. The room was nothing but bare wire and cold, empty metal shelves. The physical assets he needed had been relocated to a secure, undisclosed warehouse months ago as part of my standard disaster preparation protocols. Brandon fell to his knees on the anti-static flooring, his hands gripping his perfectly styled hair as his breathing spiraled into a full-blown panic attack. The multi-million-dollar score he had promised Patricia was a ghost. Sitting perfectly in the absolute center of the empty room, illuminated under the harsh glare of the single spotlight, was a small white piece of heavy cardstock paper. It had been left there by David just before the evacuation. Brandon crawled forward on his hands and knees. He picked up the cardstock, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold it steady. Through the high-definition ceiling camera, I zoomed in tightly, watching his eyes read the bold black ink printed across the page. You cannot steal what is already watching you. Enjoy the IRS audit, Brandon. The bunker was suffocatingly quiet after Brandon's panicked phone call ended. I sat back in my chair, staring at the digital map, tracking my brother's erratic movements away from the exotic car dealership. The financial blockade I had initiated was working flawlessly, but it was only the opening salvo. Patricia now knew she was locked out of the auxiliary funds. She knew the walls were closing in, even if she did not yet understand who was pulling the strings. That desperation was exactly what I was counting on. Fear makes greedy people reckless. It makes them blind. And right now, Patricia was completely blinded by the $50 million prize she believed was mere inches from her grasp. I swiveled my chair toward the secondary bank of monitors. Harrison was already in position. We had outfitted him with a microscopic high-definition camera disguised as a lapel pin and a secure two-way audio feed. He was sitting in a remarkably sterile glass-enclosed conference room high above the Chicago skyline. Across the polished mahogany table sat Patricia, flanked by two men in suits that cost more than my first car. These were not standard probate attorneys. They were high-end fixers, the kind of corrupt legal sharks who specialized in laundering money, hiding assets, and making legal roadblocks vanish for the right price. As I watched the live feed, my forensic software ran background diagnostics on the two lawyers. The lead counsel, a man named Sterling Vance, had a history of disciplinary hearings that miraculously disappeared right before disbarment. They were expensive, prohibitively expensive. I pulled up Patricia's personal credit ledger, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of her recent financial activity. The data painted a pathetic, horrifying picture of my mother's deeply rooted greed. She had not just hired these fixers, she had leveraged her entire existence to pay their exorbitant non-refundable retainers. She had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on her home, liquidated her meager retirement accounts, and secured a highly predatory short-term bridge loan with an astronomical interest rate. She was absolutely bleeding cash. She had bet every single asset she possessed on the absolute certainty that she was about to inherit my $50 million trust. It was a staggering display of financial recklessness, but it fit her psychological profile perfectly. I remembered being 12 years old, coming home from school to find my modest, hard-earned collection of rare coins missing from my bottom drawer. I had spent years searching for them. Patricia had pawned them for pennies on the dollar to pay for a single month of membership at a local tennis club, just to rub shoulders with wealthy men. She would always trade long-term stability for the immediate gratification of perceived status. Now the stakes were simply higher. Patricia drummed her manicured fingernails against the glass table. Through the video feed, I could see the fine tremor in her hands. The pristine, grieving mother facade she had presented to the television cameras the day before was rapidly deteriorating. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she kept casting frantic, darting glances at her smartphone resting face up on the table. She was undoubtedly receiving a steady stream of panicked text messages from Brandon regarding their frozen accounts. The digital noose was tightening, and she could feel it cutting off her oxygen. Harrison sat completely perfectly still, projecting the aura of a weary bureaucratic trust executor who just wanted the paperwork cleared from his desk. He opened his battered leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them smoothly across the polished wood toward Patricia and her legal team. As the sole executor of Arthur Sterling's trust, Harrison said, his voice carrying a perfect note of dry professional detachment, I am required to finalize the transfer routing protocols before the probate judge signs the final release at your memorial event this weekend. Once the judge signs the declaration, the primary holding account will automatically initiate the wire transfer. I need you to verify the destination routing numbers for the offshore accounts you provided yesterday. In the underground bunker, Detective Russo stepped up behind my chair, his eyes locked on the monitor. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest. This was the moment of absolute truth. The routing numbers Harrison had just handed them were not the Cayman Island accounts Patricia's lawyers had originally set up. I had intercepted their communications, wiped their destination codes, and replaced them with a series of numbers I had meticulously generated overnight. The new routing numbers looked identical to standard international offshore codes, but they were a digital mirage. They were a direct conduit to a federal honeypot account, an impenetrable, heavily monitored digital vault operated jointly by the FBI and the Department of the Treasury. The absolute second Patricia authorized those specific numbers, she would be committing textbook, irrefutable wire fraud on a federal level. She would be signing her own criminal indictment. Vance, the lead attorney, picked up the paperwork. He produced a gold-plated pen from his breast pocket and began to review the routing codes with a practiced predatory eye. He dragged the tip of the pen down the column of numbers, murmuring quietly to his associate. I watched his face closely through the lapel camera. Suddenly his hand stopped, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He leaned closer to the document, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the specific sequence of the Swift code. "He is a shark," Russo muttered, his voice low and tense in the bunker. "He recognizes the clearinghouse sequence. He knows something is off." My hands gripped the edge of my desk. Vance looked up, placing his hand flat over the signature line. "Hold on a moment," Vance said, his tone instantly guarded. "Patricia, do not sign this yet. The intermediary routing sequence on this transfer order does not match the standard Caribbean banking protocol we established. The clearinghouse identifier looks like a domestic Federal Reserve code. I need to run this through our compliance software before we authorize the transfer. This could trigger an automatic flag." Patricia's phone vibrated violently against the glass table. The screen lit up with another incoming call from Brandon. She stared at the buzzing phone, then looked up at Harrison and finally turned her wild, bloodshot eyes to her attorney. The panic that had been simmering just beneath the surface completely boiled over. She had leveraged her house. Her accounts were frozen. Her son was stranded in the city with no money. She needed the $50 million today, and she was not going to let a cautious lawyer stand in her way. "We do not have time for compliance software," Patricia snapped, her voice sharp and shrill, echoing loudly in the sterile boardroom. "Patricia, listen to me," Vance urged, trying to pull the documents out of her reach. "If this routing number is compromised, the funds could be intercepted. We need to delay the signing until I can verify the destination." "Delay!" Patricia shrieked, her mask completely shattering. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She slammed her hands down on the table, leaning aggressively toward the lawyer. "I am paying you to facilitate this transfer, not to drag your feet. My company accounts are frozen. My son cannot even buy a cup of coffee. I am not losing this money because you are paranoid." Before Vance could physically stop her, Patricia snatched the gold pen directly from his hand. She grabbed the transfer authorization documents, pulled them to her chest, and violently scrawled her signature across the bottom line. She signed her name with such forceful, desperate aggression that the pen tore straight through the heavy paper. She threw the signed documents back across the table toward Harrison. "It is done," she breathed heavily, her eyes wide and manic. "The numbers are authorized. Make sure the judge has the final release ready at the memorial on Saturday. I want this nightmare finished." Harrison calmly picked up the documents, carefully inspecting the torn signature. He slid them back into his battered leather briefcase and clicked the locks shut. "Understood, Patricia," he said smoothly. "I will see you at the memorial." Back in the bunker, Russo exhaled a long, heavy breath, a rare smile breaking across his grim face. "She took the bait," he said quietly. "The second that judge signs the release on Saturday, those funds attempt to clear into the federal honeypot. We will have her dead to rights on felony wire fraud conspiracy and attempted theft of an estate." I stared at the frozen image of my mother on the monitor. She looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly triumphant. She genuinely believed she had just won. She believed she had outsmarted everyone, bulldozed her attorneys, and secured a lifetime of stolen luxury. She had absolutely no idea that she had just locked the doors of her own federal prison cell. I leaned back, a cold, empty smile forming on my lips. The trap was perfectly sprung. All that was left was the party. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive, overcast sky, the kind of dreary Chicago weather that perfectly suited a funeral. For Patricia and Brandon, it was the backdrop for their ultimate victory lap. For me, it was the dawn of my resurrection. I stood in the center of the secure, safe house bedroom, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The exhausted, terrified woman who had washed up on a Bahamian beach was entirely gone. In her place stood a corporate executioner. I reached into the garment bag Harrison had procured for me and pulled out the suit. It was a sharp, impeccably tailored, double-breasted power suit in a shade of brilliant, unapologetic crimson red. I slipped the jacket over my shoulders, feeling the heavy silk lining settle against my skin. As I adjusted the lapels, a distinct memory surfaced, sharp and bitter. I was 16, preparing for my high school debate championship. I had saved my allowance for months to buy a red blazer. I felt invincible in it. Patricia had taken one look at me in the kitchen, sneered, and marched me back upstairs. She ripped the blazer off my arms, threw it in the trash, and forced me into a drab, shapeless gray cardigan. "Red draws too much attention, Vanessa." She had snapped her fingernails, digging into my wrist. "You look desperate and cheap. Stop trying to outshine your brother. Do not ever wear that color under my roof again." I smoothed the crimson fabric of my pantsuit, locking eyes with my reflection. Patricia had spent my entire life trying to render me invisible, a colorless ghost meant only to generate wealth and stay quietly in the shadows. Today, I wanted all the attention. Today, there would be absolutely no shadows left for her to hide in. I paired the suit with a pair of sharp black stiletto heels and pulled my dark hair back into a severe, unyielding twist. I applied a matching red lipstick, turning my mouth into a weapon. I looked exactly like the apex predator my mother had unwittingly created. I grabbed my secure tablet and walked out to the transport van waiting in the underground garage. Detective Russo was leaning against the reinforced side panel, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed me one, his eyes scanning my outfit with a silent nod of approval. He knew exactly what this wardrobe choice meant. It was a declaration of war. We drove in silence to a designated staging area half a mile from the Oak Brook Country Club. The staging area was a heavily modified, nondescript plumbing van that served as the mobile command center for Russo's cybercrimes unit. I stepped inside the cramped, windowless interior. The walls were lined with glowing monitors and radio scanning equipment. 3 of Russo's top technical operatives were already hard at work, their fingers flying across illuminated keyboards. "We are positioned precisely on the perimeter of the club's wireless network," the lead operative, a young woman named Maya, stated without looking away from her dual screens. "The Oak Brook Country Club might cater to billionaires, but their digital security architecture is woefully outdated. They are running a legacy firewall from 5 years ago. I am slicing through it right now." I took a seat beside her, plugging my own encrypted tablet into their central console. "I do not just want to monitor their feeds," I instructed, pulling up the schematic I had drafted. "I need complete, unadulterated control of the audiovisual systems in the grand ballroom. I want the microphone frequencies, the surround sound speaker arrays, and the massive projection screens they use for corporate retreats. When I give the signal, I need to isolate the main podium microphone and cut all other audio in the room." Maya nodded, her fingers moving in a blur. "You have it. I am patching your tablet directly into their central media server. You will be acting as the primary administrator. You can override their AV technician with a single keystroke." Within 20 minutes, the monitors inside our surveillance van blinked to life, feeding us a crystal-clear, high-definition live stream from the 4 security cameras positioned in the corners of the grand ballroom. The visual clarity was flawless. I leaned forward, my hands tightly gripping my coffee cup, as the scene of my own memorial service unfolded before me. Patricia had spared absolutely no expense. The ballroom was transformed into an opulent, sickeningly lavish display of fabricated grief. Massive, towering ice sculptures shaped like weeping angels stood at the entrance. The tables were draped in black velvet and covered in hundreds of imported white lilies. I hated white lilies. They gave me a severe headache. Patricia knew that perfectly well, which made the floral choice a final petty insult to my memory. A massive gilded portrait of me rested on a wooden easel next to the main podium. It was a corporate headshot from 5 years ago, the only photograph Patricia could likely find, seeing as we had not taken a picture together in over a decade. The room was rapidly filling up with attendees. I watched the local media crews setting up their heavy broadcast cameras on the risers at the back of the hall. Patricia had ensured the press was invited, desperate to maintain the public pressure on the probate court. Wealthy socialites, country club members who had never spoken a single word to me, and various local politicians mingled near the open bar holding crystal champagne flutes and speaking in hushed, somber tones. I spotted several of my former employees from Vanguard Financial Forensics standing near the back, looking genuinely devastated. They were the only authentic element in the entire room, and it pained me to see them mourning. But they needed to play their part just a little longer. And then there she was. Patricia entered the ballroom, clinging weakly to Brandon's arm. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored black morning dress, a matching wide-brimmed hat with a dramatic veil and an exquisite string of black pearls. She looked like a grieving widow from a classic cinema masterpiece. Brandon walked beside her, his face locked in a mask of stoic sorrow, though I could see the frantic, twitchy energy in his eyes. He was completely on edge, terrified by the financial trap closing around him, yet forced to maintain his public composure. I watched my mother work the room. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She approached a group of city councilmen, pressing a tissue to her face, her shoulders shaking with simulated sobs. They patted her arm, offering their profound condolences. She nodded bravely, accepting their sympathy, while subtly steering them toward the media cameras. It was a grotesque, masterful manipulation of human empathy. She was feeding on their pity, using it as a shield to mask her absolute greed. Then the target arrived. Judge Thomas Sterling walked through the heavy oak doors, flanked by his private security detail. He was a tall, imposing man, with a shock of white hair and a reputation for upholding the traditional values of the elite class. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick, dark leather folio. I knew exactly what that folder contained. It held the final, irreversible declaration of death and the unsealed trust release authorization. Patricia spotted the judge instantly. I watched her posture stiffen through the camera feed. Like a shark smelling blood in the water, she detached herself from the politicians and moved directly toward Judge Sterling. She grasped both of his hands, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. The judge offered her a warm, comforting smile, tapping the leather folio reassuringly. The message was clear. The paperwork was ready. The $50 million was literally moments away from her grasp. I felt Detective Russo's hand grip the back of my chair. "We are greenlit," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "My undercover tactical units are positioned at all 4 exits of the country club. The moment that money hits the federal honeypot account, we secure the perimeter. No one leaves." I nodded, my eyes dropping to the secondary tablet resting on my lap. This device was running a highly illegal, exact digital mirror of Brandon's personal smartphone. I had installed the cloning software during his brief, disastrous visit to the exotic car dealership. Every text message, every email, every frantic digital communication he sent or received populated instantly on my screen. For the past hour, the family group chat had been entirely silent. But as Patricia guided the judge toward the front row of reserved seating, the screen suddenly illuminated. A new message from Brandon appeared. I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted messaging application. "Brandon, the IRS agents just seized my condo. I need cash now." I watched the video feed. I saw Brandon standing near the ice sculptures pull his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device. He stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. He looked up, his panicked eyes locking onto Patricia across the room. Patricia felt his gaze. She subtly pulled her own phone from her designer handbag, shielding the screen from the judge sitting beside her. I watched her fingers move rapidly. A second later, the response appeared on my clone tablet. "Patricia, keep your mouth shut and smile for the cameras. The $50 million will be in my account in 10 minutes. I read the text twice, a dark, genuine laugh escaping my lips. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She was so close to the finish line, she could not see the massive steel trap suspended directly over her head. She truly believed that signing a piece of paper would magically solve a federal raid. "Maya." I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register. Patch my microphone through to the main ballroom speakers. Isolate the feed. I want maximum volume. Maya typed a rapid sequence of commands and hit the enter key. You are live, Vanessa. The entire club is yours. I stood up inside the surveillance van, smoothing the front of my power red suit. I adjusted the wireless microphone clipped to my lapel. I looked at Detective Russo, giving him a single sharp nod. It is time to crash the party, I said. I stepped out of the van and walked directly toward the front doors of the Oak Brook Country Club, ready to deliver a eulogy they would never forget. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Brook Country Club Grand Ballroom yielded silently as I slipped through the rear service entrance. I stepped into the suffocating shadows behind the velvet drapes lining the back wall, my crimson power suit blending perfectly into the heavy fabric. The air inside the hall was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and the sickening funereal stench of hundreds of white lilies. Before me sat 500 of Chicago's elite. Wealthy socialites, corporate titans, and local politicians occupied the neatly arranged rows of velvet-cushioned chairs. In the back, standing on elevated risers, local media crews trained their high-definition broadcast cameras toward the front of the room. It was a standing-room-only event, a masterclass in manufactured mourning. I stood perfectly still in the darkness, my eyes fixed on the brilliantly illuminated stage. Patricia stood at this grand mahogany podium. She was a vision of tragic elegance draped in custom black couture, her face partially obscured by a delicate mourning veil. Beside her, Brandon sat in a high-backed chair, gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His leg bounced in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his eyes darting frantically toward the glowing screen of the smartphone clutched in his palm. The IRS had seized his condo. His bank accounts were locked. He was drowning in real time, completely invisible to the crowd mourning the sister he despised. Patricia tapped the microphone. The subtle sound echoed crisply through the cavernous room. Maya's audio patch was working flawlessly, delivering every breath of my mother's performance directly into my wireless earpiece. Thank you all for being here today. Patricia began, her voice quivering with a perfectly calibrated tremor. She paused, reaching up with a lace-trimmed handkerchief to dab at a completely dry eye. Losing a child is a pain that defies language. It is a fundamental disruption of the natural order. You do not just lose a daughter, you lose a piece of your own soul. A collective sympathetic murmur rippled through the audience. I watched a prominent city councilman in the third row wipe a tear from his cheek. The sheer audacity of her performance was mesmerizing. Vanessa was a complex soul. Patricia continued, her tone shifting to one of profound, weary maternal sorrow. She was brilliant, fiercely independent, but she was also incredibly troubled. From a very young age, she built walls around her heart. She pushed away the people who tried the hardest to reach her. I gripped the velvet drape, my fingernails biting into my palms. I remembered the exact moment those walls were built. I was 9 years old, shivering in the freezing Chicago rain, pounding my small fists against the locked front door, while Patricia sat inside, sipping red wine and watching television. I had not pushed my family away. I had been systematically discarded because I did not fit Patricia's pristine, marketable narrative. As a mother, you never stop trying, Patricia said, her voice rising in a crescendo of fabricated anguish. You never stop reaching out. I spent countless sleepless nights praying for her to find peace, leaving the door unlocked, hoping she would finally realize that her family was her safe harbor. No matter how far she strayed, no matter how relentlessly she rejected our help, our bond remained absolute. A beautiful, unbroken bond between a mother and her daughter that not even death can sever. She bowed her head, allowing a single perfectly timed sob to escape her lips. Brandon stood up, wrapping a supportive arm around her shoulders. It was a beautiful tableau of familial solidarity. It was also a complete, verifiable lie. She was not mourning a lost child. She was performing a mandated legal ritual, stalling for time, while she waited for a $50 million check to clear. Thank you, Patricia whispered into the microphone, leaning heavily against Brandon. To honor Vanessa's memory, we have prepared a brief presentation. We want you to remember her as we do. The grand chandeliers dimmed to a soft amber glow. A massive motorized projection screen descended silently from the ceiling directly behind the podium. Somber, swelling orchestral music began to play through the surround sound speakers, filling the ballroom with an atmosphere of profound tragedy. The slideshow flickered to life. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The first image showed me at 14 standing alone on the edge of a school playground, my posture awkward and isolated. The next slide immediately transitioned to a photograph of Patricia and Brandon laughing together on a sun-drenched beach, looking like the epitome of warmth and inclusion. The subtext was blindingly obvious. I was the dark, brooding rain cloud refusing to participate in their sunshine. Slide after slide painted the exact same fraudulent picture. They used candid, unflattering photos of me working late in my office, my face pale and exhausted, juxtaposed against images of Brandon receiving fraudulent corporate awards. They were framing me as a tragic, lost workaholic who had squandered her life while elevating Brandon as the stable, successful son who carried the family legacy. It was a calculated assassination of my character designed entirely to justify why the Vanguard fortune rightfully belonged in their hands. I watched Brandon in the stage shadows. He was not looking at the screen. He was staring at his phone, his face contorting into a mask of pure terror. The federal honeypot trap was tightening. His creditors were circling. He leaned over, whispering frantically into Patricia's ear. I could read his lips perfectly from the back of the room. We need the money now. They took the cars. Patricia did not even turn her head. She maintained her sorrowful gaze toward the projection screen, but her hand snapped out her perfectly manicured nails, digging viciously into Brandon's thigh. I saw him wince in pain. She hissed a response through clenched, smiling teeth. Keep your mouth shut and smile for the cameras. The $50 million will be in my account in 10 minutes. One. The slideshow concluded with a faded, grainy photograph of a white lily. The light slowly illuminated the ballroom once again. There was not a dry eye in the house. Patricia had successfully gaslighted 500 of the most powerful people in the city, turning her lifelong abuse into a tragic tale of unrequited maternal love. From the front row, Judge Thomas Sterling rose to his feet. He adjusted his heavy black robes, a figure of absolute, unquestionable legal authority. He carried the dark leather folio tightly against his side. The private security details flanking the stage stepped back respectfully as he ascended the wooden stairs and approached the mahogany lectern. Patricia stepped aside, dabbing her eyes one final time. Her gaze never left the leather folio. The sheer predatory greed radiating from her posture was unmistakable. We are gathered today not just to mourn the passing of Vanessa Sterling, but to find closure. The judge began, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the lingering sniffles of the audience. The law requires us to finalize the earthly affairs of those who have departed, ensuring their legacy is placed into the hands of their rightful heirs. It is a solemn duty, one that brings legal finality to a tragic loss. Judge Sterling opened the leather folio and laid it flat across the slanted surface of the lectern. He withdrew a stack of heavy watermarked parchment paper, the death declaration and the unsealed trust transfer authorizations. The documents that would instantly wire $50 million directly into the federal honeypot account Detective Russo was currently monitoring. Lee. As the executor of the estate has verified the routing protocols, it is my duty to oversee the final signature, the judge stated, turning toward Patricia. Patricia, as the primary beneficiary and sole surviving guardian, your signature on these transfer documents will finalize the probate release. Patricia stepped up to the lectern. Her hands, which had been shaking with simulated grief just moments before, were suddenly perfectly steady. She looked down at the documents. The routing numbers I had fabricated stared back at her, a digital death sentence waiting for authorization. The judge reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a heavy gold fountain pen. He held it out to her. Patricia took the gold pen. She leaned over the mahogany lectern, her dark mourning veil falling forward to shadow her face. She positioned the tip of the pen directly over the primary signature line. The pen touched the paper. The heavy gold nib of the fountain pen pressed firmly into the thick, watermarked parchment. Black ink began to pool, flowing from the sharp metal tip, to form the very first decisive curve of Patricia's signature. She was less than half a second away from legally authorizing the fraudulent transfer of $50 million. In the cramped windowless interior of the surveillance van, I did not hesitate. I gave the signal. Maya slammed her palm flat onto the execution key. The digital hijack was instantaneous and brutally effective. Inside the grand ballroom of the Oak Brook Country Club, the somber weeping orchestral music did not simply fade away into a respectful silence. It was violently decapitated. A sudden ear-splitting screech of pure electronic static ripped through the premium overhead surround sound speakers. The noise was so incredibly loud and physically painful that several elderly guests in the front rows cried out in shock, throwing their hands over their ears and flinching backward against the velvet upholstery of their chairs. On the brightly illuminated stage, Patricia jerked upright, as if she had been physically struck. The sudden movement sent the gold pen skidding across the legal document, leaving a jagged, ugly black scar of spilled ink across the signature line. She tapped the microphone frantically, a sharp, whining feedback loop piercing the heavy air. Brandon leapt from his high-backed chair, his eyes darting wildly toward the ceiling speakers, as if expecting the crystal chandeliers to come crashing down upon them. Directly behind them, the massive motorized projection screen spasmed. The faded melancholic image of a single white lily, the centerpiece of Patricia's fabricated memorial presentation, shattered into a million jagged, multicolored pixels. The screen flashed violently between stark, blinding white and pitch black, casting erratic, aggressive strobe-like shadows across Patricia's horrified face. The meticulously curated illusion of a peaceful, dignified memorial was entirely destroyed in a span of 3 seconds. I watched the live high-definition monitor as the harsh static abruptly cut off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the 500 attendees. No one moved a single muscle. No one dared to breathe. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden, aggressive chaos. Then a voice boomed from the overhead speakers. It was not the automated, apologetic voice of a country club audiovisual technician experiencing a technical error. The audio was crisp, digitally enhanced for maximum clarity, and completely unmistakable. It was Patricia's voice. "Yes, the passport is burned." The words echoed sharply off the vaulted, painted ceilings of the banquet hall. The audio feed was pristine, capturing the exact callous, cold-blooded cadence my mother had used while pacing the floor of that luxury Bahamas hotel room. In the ballroom, a collective sharp intake of breath swept through the massive crowd. 500 wealthy socialites, local politicians, and seasoned media members stared at the stage in absolute paralyzed shock. I watched a prominent city councilman slowly lower his champagne flute, his face draining of color. Near the back of the room, David, my former lead manager from Vanguard Financial Forensics, suddenly stood up straight, his military posture locking into place as realization dawned across his stern features. The audio recording continued to play, merciless and deafening. "Her flight leaves in an hour. I paid the pilot in cash. No flight plan, no radar tracking. Just an empty ocean." Patricia stood frozen behind the heavy mahogany podium. Her jaw dropped open in a silent, grotesque mask of absolute terror. The gold pen slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the wood, before rolling off the stage and vanishing into the sea of white lilies below. She stared blindly out at the sea of horrified faces, her eyes wide and manic behind her delicate black lace mourning veil. She had turned entirely chalk white, looking exactly like a ghost who had just been forced to witness the brutal reality of her own murder. By tomorrow, the recording of Patricia's voice declared, the chilling satisfaction in her tone amplified 100 times over, she will officially be lost at sea. The trust will trigger the bereavement clause. The $50 million is ours. Just keep Brandon away from the offshore accounts until the wire clears. The entire grand ballroom erupted into total bedlam. The suffocating silence shattered into a deafening roar of gasps, angry shouts, and frantic murmurs. The media crews stationed on the elevated risers at the back of the room instantly scrambled into action. Heavy broadcast camera lenses swung wildly away from the wide crowd shots and zoomed straight into Patricia's terrified face. The blinding white flashes of professional photography began to pop relentlessly, capturing the exact humiliating second her immaculate grieving mother facade crumbled into dust. Judge Thomas Sterling did not hesitate. The veteran probate jurist reacted with the lightning speed of a man suddenly realizing he was standing in the exact epicenter of a massive federal crime scene. He lunged across the wooden podium and violently ripped the leather folio out from under Patricia's trembling hands. He clutched the trust documents tightly to his chest, taking 2 large, deliberate steps away from my mother, as if she had suddenly become highly contagious. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Sterling roared, his booming, authoritative voice cutting effortlessly through the rising panic of the crowd. "Patricia, what the hell is this audio?" Patricia gripped the edges of the mahogany lectern so hard her knuckles turned a bruised, sickly purple. She leaned desperately into the microphone, her voice a frantic, breathless stammer that carried perfectly over the sound system. "It is a fake," she shrieked, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her face as she reached up and violently ripped the black mourning veil away. "It is artificial intelligence. It is a deep fake. Someone has hacked the audio system. Shut it off. Somebody shut that screen off right now." She looked frantically toward the back of the room, waving her arms erratically at the unseen audiovisual technicians trapped in their booth. "This is a cruel, disgusting prank. My daughter is dead. I am a grieving mother. Turn it off." Brandon was completely paralyzed. He stood frozen beside his overturned chair, his face entirely drained of blood, rendering him a sickly, translucent white. He looked back and forth between the glaring projection screen and the horrified, disgusted faces of the corporate elite who had funded his lavish lifestyle just weeks prior. The realization of his total, inescapable destruction was visible in his wide, unblinking eyes. The text message he had sent just minutes earlier about his seized condo and frozen accounts collided violently with the reality of the audio playing overhead. He slowly backed away from Patricia, his hands raised defensively in the air, attempting to physically distance himself from the radioactive center of the stage. He was abandoning her just as quickly as she had abandoned me. I stepped out of the mobile command van and into the damp, cold Chicago air. The biting wind felt incredible against my face. Detective Russo flanked my right side, his hand resting casually near his heavy-duty radio. 3 plainclothes federal agents, their badges visibly clipped to their belts, fell in step behind us as we marched across the paved driveway toward the rear service entrance of the Oak Brook Country Club. Inside the ballroom, Patricia was still stammering into the live microphone, her voice growing increasingly hysterical and unhinged as the crowd visibly turned against her. "She drowned. It was a tragic boating accident. You all saw the reports. This is extortion. I demand you arrest whoever is responsible for this. I demand you clear this room." I reached the heavy, towering mahogany doors at the very back of the grand banquet hall. I could hear the sheer chaos, the angry shouts, and Patricia's desperate lies vibrating through the thick wood. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the crisp, heavy silk of my red power suit settle perfectly against my skin. The crimson fabric was a blaring siren, a total rejection of the invisible, compliant daughter she had tried to manufacture. I had waited half my miserable life for this exact second. I placed both hands flat against the polished brass handles of the double doors. I pushed. The heavy mahogany doors slammed open with a concussive, deafening crash that echoed like a gunshot over the chaotic din of the ballroom. The sudden, violent noise immediately silenced the shouting crowd. 500 heads snapped toward the rear entrance in perfect unison. At that exact moment, Maya executed the final command from the surveillance van. Every single overhead light in the massive banquet hall bypassed its dimmer switch and snapped to maximum blinding brightness. The sudden flood of harsh illumination washed over the crowd, blinding the guests and exposing every terrified, shocked expression in the room. The staccato click of my stilettos against the polished hardwood floor broke the absolute silence of the grand ballroom. I stepped out of the blinding halo of the rear doorway and into the stark, unforgiving light of the room. The transition from the audio of Patricia cold, bloodedly plotting my demise to my physical manifestation in the hall created a psychological whiplash that paralyzed the audience. The murmurs began instantly. They started as low, confused whispers, rapidly escalating into a frantic, chaotic buzz as my face came into focus for the 500 guests. The sea of black mourning attire physically parted for me. Wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and local politicians practically shoved each other out of the way, creating a wide, unobstructed path straight down the center aisle. They stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, as if a vengeful spirit had just materialized from the polished floorboards. I kept my gaze locked, dead ahead. My crimson power suit practically glowed against the drab, funereal backdrop of the room. It was a beacon of defiance. For decades, Patricia had demanded I blend in, forcing me into dull, shapeless clothing. She always claimed red drew too much attention and made me look desperate to outshine my brother. She demanded I remain an invisible asset. Today, I was the main event, and I demanded every single ounce of their attention. Brandon broke first. The sheer terror of his collapsing reality manifested as violent physical panic. The $50 million he had been counting on to save him from federal indictment was evaporating before his eyes. He scrambled out from behind the front row of velvet chairs, his expensive morning suit rumpled and sweat-stained. He looked nothing like the arrogant golden child who had terrorized my staff just days prior. He looked pathetic. "Stop her!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he lunged into the center aisle. He sprinted directly toward me, his hands outstretched like a desperate man trying to catch smoke. "She is not real. It is a trick. Someone grab her before she gets to the stage." He did not make it 3 steps. Detective Russo moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned predator. He stepped smoothly out from the shadows of the side wings, inserting his massive frame directly into Brandon's path. Brandon slammed into the detective's chest like a bird hitting a pane of glass, bouncing backward and stumbling onto the floor. Before Brandon could scramble to his feet, 4 uniformed Chicago police officers flooded in from the side exits. They moved with coordinated military precision, forming an impenetrable tactical wall between me and my brother. One of the officers rested his hand casually on his duty belt, a silent, unmistakable warning that any further aggression would be met with immediate force. Brandon scrambled backward on his hands and knees like a crab, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with absolute panic, as the reality of the police presence finally registered. His financial crimes were no longer hidden behind closed doors. They were standing right in front of him. I walked past my brother without breaking my stride or offering him a single glance. I ascended the short wooden stairs to the illuminated stage. Patricia was frozen behind the heavy mahogany podium. She looked entirely feral. The carefully applied makeup that had perfectly accentuated her fabricated grief now stood out in harsh, unnatural contrast to her chalk-white skin. Her hands were gripping the edges of the podium so tightly I could hear the wood creaking under her manicured nails. Beside her, Judge Thomas Sterling stood completely rigid, his eyes darting between me and the fraudulent death declaration resting on the lectern. I stepped directly up to the lectern, invading Patricia's personal space, completely immune to the toxic aura she had used to control me for 34 years. The lingering scent of white lilies and her expensive perfume made my stomach turn, but I did not let my expression waver. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. The terrifyingly calm demeanor I maintained commanded the absolute attention of every single person in that massive ballroom. The silence was so profound I could hear the hum of the broadcast cameras recording every second of her destruction. I reached into the interior pocket of my crimson blazer. I retrieved a crisply folded piece of heavy stock paper. It was the exact invoice she had thrown in my face a lifetime ago, the physical manifestation of her ultimate betrayal. I unfolded it meticulously, smoothing out the sharp creases with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I slid the paper smoothly across the polished mahogany surface of the podium, stopping it directly on top of the fraudulent trust transfer documents she had been seconds away from signing. It was the invoice for the luxury yacht charter in the Bahamas, the exact charter she had booked with the money she siphoned from my business accounts while leaving me to die in a foreign hospital. "I believe this is yours," I said, my voice carrying crystal clear over the live microphone. The audio system amplified my tone, sending it bouncing off the walls, though I am afraid the cancellation fee is entirely non-refundable. Patricia stared at the piece of paper as if it were a live grenade. The undeniable proof of her cold-blooded betrayal rested right in front of her. The $50 million trust was gone. Her offshore accounts were exposed. Her fraudulent narrative was completely dismantled in front of the city's most powerful elites. But Patricia had never accepted defeat gracefully. Her survival instinct was built entirely on delusion and unhinged aggression. She snapped her head up, her eyes blazing with cornered animalistic desperation. She grabbed the microphone stand, her knuckles white, and screamed directly into the sea of shocked faces. She was determined to play the victim one last time, clinging to the only strategy she knew. "She is insane," Patricia shrieked, her voice tearing through the sound system and violently echoing through the hall. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "Look at her. Look at the way she is dressed at a funeral. She orchestrated this entire sick, cruel prank just to humiliate me. She faked her own death to torture her grieving family because she has always been unstable. Arrest her. Judge Sterling, order these officers to arrest this deranged woman immediately." The crowd recoiled from the sheer venom in her voice. The sympathetic murmurs had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable, horrified silence. The local media cameras zoomed in tightly, capturing the frantic sweat beading on her forehead and the wild, uncontrolled panic in her eyes. The entire room was bearing witness to the unmasking of a monster. I did not flinch. I let her unhinged screaming echo through the hall, letting the 500 witnesses absorb the absolute toxicity of her true nature. I did not need to defend myself against her desperate, pathetic lies. The evidence would do all the talking for me. I simply smiled, a cool, detached expression of pure victory that I knew would infuriate her more than any physical blow. I turned my head slightly toward the back of the stage and raised my right hand, giving a simple, deliberate signal. Harrison stepped out from the heavy velvet curtains, adjusting his spectacles, a thick, expanding file folder of irrefutable forensic evidence clutched securely under his arm. Harrison walked to the center of the illuminated stage with the calm, methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate empires. He completely ignored the frantic, hyperventilating woman standing beside the podium. He did not spare a single glance for the brothers scrambling backward on the floor. Harrison moved with absolute purpose. He retrieved a secure, encrypted tablet from the thick file folder tucked under his arm and plugged a direct output cable into the podium's primary media port. The massive projection screen behind us, which had been flashing with chaotic, blinding static just moments before, snapped to a crisp, high-definition image. It was a scanned legal document. The paper was visibly yellowed with age, bearing my late father's unmistakable, heavy-handed signature at the bottom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison spoke into the microphone, his voice a dry, resonant baritone that commanded instant respect from the room of corporate elites. "What you are looking at is the authentic, unadulterated last will and testament of Richard Sterling, drafted and notarized exactly 19 years ago." Harrison tapped the screen of his tablet. The projection instantly zoomed in on a specific, heavily highlighted paragraph in the center of the document. This clause explicitly names Vanessa Sterling as the sole irrevocable heir to the Vanguard estate upon her 25th birthday. Harrison continued reading the legal jargon with flawless articulation. It goes on to state that Patricia Sterling was legally and permanently removed as a beneficiary 2 decades ago, due to documented systemic financial misconduct and theft from corporate holding accounts. A loud collective gasp rippled through the grand ballroom. 500 wealthy socialites, country club members, and local politicians stared at the glowing screen in absolute disbelief. The carefully constructed narrative of the grieving, devoted widow had just been publicly executed. Harrison tapped his screen a second time. The projection split perfectly in half. On the left side appeared the offshore Cayman Island banking routing numbers Patricia had just attempted to use. On the right side, a detailed, itemized ledger of Brandon's recent activities populated the screen. Furthermore, Harrison stated, his tone remaining perfectly level, "We have the intercepted routing logs from this very afternoon. These logs prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Patricia Sterling just attempted to wire $50 million of estate funds into an untraceable offshore shell corporation. Beside that evidence, you will see 64 separate documented instances of Brandon Sterling forging his sister's signature to illegally authorize corporate lines of credit and drain operational capital from Vanguard Financial Forensics. Judge Thomas Sterling stared up at the massive screen, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The realization of what had almost transpired hit him like a freight train. He had been mere seconds away from legally facilitating a massive, highly publicized federal crime. He had been used. He snatched the fraudulent death declaration from the mahogany lectern. With a sharp, furious motion, he ripped the heavy watermarked parchment entirely in half, dropping the shredded pieces onto the stage floor. As the presiding judge of the probate court, I hereby immediately revoke the declaration of death for Vanessa Sterling on the grounds of overwhelming, verifiable, fraudulent intent. The judge roared, his booming voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He pointed a trembling finger at Patricia. This entire memorial is officially an active crime scene. Detective Russo stepped fully onto the stage, the heavy tread of his boots thudding ominously against the polished wood. He unclipped his radio, giving a sharp, silent hand signal to the uniformed officers positioned at the room's exits to lock down the perimeter. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of folded stamped warrants. Patricia and Brandon Sterling Russo, announced his voice, a low, gravelly rumble that carried absolute authority. I hold federal arrest warrants for both of you. The charges include wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit extortion, and reckless endangerment. Patricia backed away from the detective, her expensive stiletto heels catching awkwardly on the thick microphone cord. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The refined, elegant socialite was entirely gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, screaming so loudly her voice cracked and distorted through the speakers. "You ungrateful wretch!" Patricia shrieked, her chest heaving as she sprayed absolute venom across the stage. "I gave you everything. I put a roof over your head. I paid for that luxurious Bahamas vacation to give you a break from your miserable, lonely, pathetic life. You are nothing without my charity. I funded your entire existence. I made you who you are." The crowd recoiled from the sheer hostility in her voice. The sympathetic murmurs had completely vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable, horrified silence. The local media cameras zoomed in tightly, capturing the frantic sweat beading on her forehead and the wild, uncontrolled panic in her wide eyes. The entire room was bearing witness to the unmasking of a monster. I did not flinch. I let her unhinged screaming echo through the hall, letting the 500 witnesses absorb the absolute toxicity of her true nature. I did not need to raise my voice or defend myself against her desperate, pathetic lies. I simply smiled, a cool, detached expression of pure victory that I knew would infuriate her more than any physical blow. I tapped the secondary tablet resting on the podium. The massive projection screen behind us shifted one final time. The image of a sleek, heavy titanium Centurion black card appeared, bearing my name in raised silver lettering. Beneath it scrolled months of highlighted, verified, and heavily itemized bank statements. I turned to face the audience, leaning slightly into the microphone, projecting my voice with terrifying calm. "Let us talk about charity," I said, the icy edge in my tone slicing through Patricia's lingering hysteria. I gestured toward the screen behind me. The Bahamas luxury yacht charter she just mentioned, paid in full from my personal accounts. The mortgage on the massive Gold Coast estate Patricia currently lives in, paid entirely by me. Brandon's exotic car leases and his outstanding gambling debts, paid by me. I hit the next button, bringing up a massive invoice bearing the Oak Brook Country Club logo. Even the exorbitant membership fees allowing you to stand in this very room today were funded entirely by Vanguard Financial Forensics. I continued, locking eyes with the horrified city councilman in the front row. A company I built from the ground up while they sat at home draining the accounts. I turned my head slowly, looking back at my mother. The final shreds of her high society facade evaporated into the cold air. "You are not a generous matriarch," I said. my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried to the very back of the hall. You are a broke, desperate fraud who has not had a single legitimate dollar to her name in over a decade. You lived off my blood and my sweat. And when I finally cut the cord and stopped paying for your lavish lifestyle, you tried to kill me to keep the cash flowing. The societal ruin in the room was absolute. The wealthy elite who had spent the last hour offering Patricia their profound sympathies were visibly disgusted. The local politicians who had patted her arm were actively stepping backward, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of her crimes. Patricia's social standing, the only currency she had ever truly valued, was instantly and permanently incinerated. Detective Russo did not wait for her to formulate another lie. He stepped forward, grabbing Patricia's wrists with practiced efficiency. She thrashed wildly, kicking out with her designer shoes and screaming incoherently, but Russo easily overpowered her. He twisted her arms behind her back, the sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing sharply across the silent ballroom was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Simultaneously, two uniformed police officers hauled Brandon up from the floor. He was entirely limp, a dead weight, sobbing uncontrollably as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The arrogance that had defined his entire miserable existence was gone. The heavy steel cuffs clamped down tightly over his wrists. As the officers began dragging him forcefully across the stage toward the side exit, Brandon's legs gave out. He thrashed against their grip, twisting his head back to look at me. His face was a mess of tears and terror. The reality of a federal prison sentence had finally broken him. "Vanessa, please!" Brandon screamed, his voice a pathetic, agonizing wail that echoed through the grand ballroom. "Please tell them to stop. Do not let them do this to us. We are your blood. We are your family." I stared down at my brother from the elevated stage. Brandon was thrashing weakly against the unyielding grip of the Chicago police officers, his expensive custom-tailored morning suit now stained with the sweat of his own panic and the dust of the ballroom floor. His face was a grotesque mask of absolute terror, stripped entirely of the arrogant, sneering superiority he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists clanked loudly as he tried to dig his heels into the polished wood, desperate to stop his inevitable forward momentum. His pathetic wail echoed through the silent, captivated room, a desperate plea relying on a biological connection he had spent 34 years actively desecrating. I did not raise my voice to compete with his frantic sobbing. I did not need to. I leaned slightly toward the microphone fixed to the mahogany lectern, letting my terrifyingly calm demeanor freeze the air in the grand ballroom. I looked down at him with absolute ice in my veins. "Blood did not leave me stranded in a foreign country to die," I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, devastating finality. Brandon's mouth snapped shut. He stared up at me, his chest heaving, the realization dawning in his eyes that his usual manipulations were completely useless. I shifted my gaze toward Patricia, who was currently pinned against the far wall by Detective Russo, her flawless hair in ruins, her face twisted in a feral, hateful snarl. Blood did not kick a 9-year-old out into the cold to steal her future. I continued, the heavy silence of the room amplifying every single syllable. "You aren't my family. You're just the criminals who robbed me. And today my tab is fully paid." I gave a sharp, definitive nod to Detective Russo. "Take them out of here," Russo commanded, his deep voice slicing through the remaining tension. The uniformed officers hauled Brandon upward, dragging him backward through the center aisle. Patricia fought with the vicious, desperate energy of a cornered animal screaming absolute nonsense about conspiracies and ungrateful daughters, as Russo firmly guided her forward. The crowd of 500 wealthy elites, politicians, and socialites physically recoiled, pressing themselves against the velvet chairs to avoid touching my mother as she was paraded through their ranks in steel handcuffs. The towering mahogany doors slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate. The silence inside the ballroom lasted for precisely 2 seconds before the media crews broke the spell. A chaotic stampede of reporters, cameramen, and journalists rushed the rear exits, desperate to capture the footage of Patricia and Brandon Sterling being shoved into the back of marked federal police cruisers. The high society guests began to rapidly disperse, murmuring in shocked, hushed tones, thoroughly scandalized by the brutal reality they had just witnessed. Judge Sterling approached me on the stage, his face pale and deeply lined with the stress of the morning's events. He looked at the shredded pieces of the fraudulent death declarations scattered across the floor, then looked up at me with profound, weary respect. "Miss Sterling," the judge said softly, extending his hand, "I am deeply sorry for what you have endured. The probate court will expedite the total restoration of your legal status and the immediate transfer of your father's trust. You have my word." I shook his hand firmly, feeling the last lingering ghost of Patricia's oppressive control evaporate into the air. "Thank you, Your Honor." 6 months later, the justice I had demanded was absolute, unyielding, and completely unapologetic. The legal fallout from the Oak Brook Country Club memorial was a swift and merciless spectacle. Patricia and Brandon had attempted to mount a vigorous legal defense, desperately trying to spin a narrative of a hostile corporate takeover. It failed spectacularly. Harrison's meticulously documented file, combined with the intercepted audio from the Bahamas and the digital forensics provided by Maya's cyber unit, created a flawless, impenetrable wall of evidence. Faced with decades in federal prison, Brandon had immediately broken. He attempted to secure a favorable plea deal by entirely turning on his mother, offering to testify that Patricia was the sole mastermind behind the attempted murder and wire fraud. The prosecution happily took his confession, but refused his deal. Today, Brandon was serving a 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. The IRS had systematically seized, liquidated, and auctioned every single asset he had ever fraudulently acquired. His luxury condo, his exotic car leases, his expensive watches, everything was gone, leaving him entirely bankrupted and entirely alone. Patricia received a 20-year sentence. The woman who had obsessed over high society galas, custom couture, and maintaining an immaculate, wealthy facade was now living in a bleak concrete cell, forced to wear a shapeless, drab gray uniform for the rest of her natural life. She had been stripped of her wealth, her social standing, and her freedom. There were no shadows left for her to hide in, and there was no one left to manipulate. Meanwhile, my resurrection was complete. With Judge Sterling's expedited ruling, I formally claimed the $50 million trust my father had rightfully left to me. But I did not simply deposit the money and walk away. I marched directly into the headquarters of Vanguard Financial Forensics, the company I had built with my own blood and sweat, and initiated a massive, aggressive expansion. I merged the trust capital with Vanguard's operational accounts, utilizing the massive influx of cash to buy out international competitors, upgrade our cybersecurity divisions, and hire the absolute best forensic accountants in the country. Within 3 months, Vanguard was no longer just a successful Chicago firm. We were an international powerhouse, tearing down fraudulent corporations and exposing financial criminals across the globe. I was finally the undisputed apex predator my father had always known I could be. The biting, bitter cold of the Chicago winter had given way to a crisp, brilliant late November evening. I stood in the massive gourmet kitchen of my newly purchased estate on the North Shore. The house was a sprawling, beautiful property made of warm mahogany natural stone and towering glass windows overlooking the restless, dark waters of Lake Michigan. It was a home filled with light, laughter, and genuine warmth, the exact antithesis of the cold, sterile museum Patricia had raised me in. It was Thanksgiving and the house was packed. I smoothed the front of my emerald green evening dress, a rich, vibrant color that refused to blend into the background. I carried a tray of roasted vegetables out of the kitchen and into the expansive, glowing dining room. A massive fire roared in the stone hearth, casting dancing amber shadows across the long oak dining table. The sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter filled the air. David, my lead manager, was seated near the fire, animatedly telling a story to several of my most loyal Vanguard employees. They had fought alongside me when my family tried to bankrupt the firm, and their loyalty was absolute. At the far end of the table, Detective Russo sat comfortably in a leather armchair, having entirely shed his intimidating tactical exterior. He was laughing deeply at a joke made by Maya, the brilliant young cyber operative who had hacked the country club audio system. Harrison sat beside them, a rare, genuine smile softening his stern, analytical features as he poured a glass of rich red wine. This was my found family. They were not bound to me by the accidental lottery of blood or the toxic obligations of DNA. They were bound to me by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the shared battles we had fought and won together. They were the people who had stood by me when I was a ghost, and they were the people who celebrated me now that I was whole. I placed the tray on the table and picked up a delicate crystal flute filled with sparkling champagne. I stood at the head of the table looking out over the sea of smiling familiar faces. I gently tapped a silver spoon against the rim of my glass. The sharp, clear chime instantly quieted the room. The conversation faded, replaced by a comfortable, loving silence as they all turned to look at me. A year ago, I began my voice steady, warm, and filled with absolute certainty. I believed that family was an anchor. I believed it was something heavy and unyielding, something that held you down in the dark and demanded you sacrifice your own light just to keep them comfortable. I looked down the length of the table, meeting Detective Russo's respectful nod, Harrison's proud gaze, and the warm smiles of my Vanguard team. But I was wrong. I continued, a genuine smile breaking across my face. Family is not an anchor. Family is the foundation you choose to build upon. It is made of the people who pull you out of the freezing water, the people who stand between you and the fire, and the people who refuse to let you remain invisible. I raised my crystal flute high into the air, the firelight catching the rising bubbles in the champagne. To survival, I said, my voice ringing clear and strong. To building a life entirely on your own terms. And to the family we choose for ourselves. To survival, the room echoed back in perfect, joyful unison, raising their glasses into the amber light. I took a sip of the cold, crisp champagne. I looked out the massive glass windows at the sprawling, beautifully illuminated grounds of my estate. There were no ghosts left to haunt me, no shadows left to fear, and no invisible chains holding me back. I was standing in the light, surrounded by the people who truly valued me, and I was finally unapologetically free.